So oftentimes that itself is just the biggest shift. And it's not as though we're not connected and then we suddenly get connected. It's more that we're realizing and recognizing how incredibly intertwined our lives are with so many other people and things and places and memories. All of this stuff is shaping our experience in every moment. But we just kind of lose sight of that. So it's not even that we're getting connected. We're just realizing that we are connected. And that's the big shift, is just shifting into that relational space. Hey, Richie. Welcome back for another episode of Dharma Lab. Good to see you.
Great to see you, Cort. Happy to be here.
So we're here to discuss what is, if not the, certainly one of the most commonly cited scientific studies, especially I think in the pandemic. This became a hot topic because there was so much social disconnection. And it's this finding that social disconnection, feeling lonely, feeling isolated, feeling alienated, all these different flavors of just not feeling like you're connected to the people in your life or to the wider society, is toxic. It's toxic not only for our mental health, for our emotional well-being, but in this particular study that we'll talk about, also for our physical health. And in fact, the meme that you kind of hear all the time is that social disconnection is as toxic as smoking, and specifically smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So I wanted to talk about that today. It's a huge, huge thing in our lives, in our society. So I thought first we could just dive in and maybe talk about how prevalent this actually is, that it actually is at epidemic levels. So maybe I could just kick it over to you. What do we know about this from just like how widespread these tears in our social fabric are these days?
Yeah, so thank you, Cort. There have been a number of surveys that have been done looking at the prevalence of loneliness and social isolation. And depending on what you read, you'll hear varying estimates, but they're all very high. A recent study done in the United States has shown that 76% of Americans report moderate to severe levels of loneliness. So these are extremely high numbers. They are numbers that have been increasing over the years. They certainly have been exacerbated by COVID, but they're not due to COVID because they preceded COVID and they didn't go back down to baseline after COVID. They're still rising, and it's really concerning because these feelings of loneliness and sense of social isolation, as we'll talk about, are not just subjective experiences, but they have important consequences for people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, and just those numbers are staggering. I mean, 76%. If you just think about that as like a health concern, imagine some sickness or some illness if 3/4 of the population had that. I mean, that's like,
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
that's
it's like
precisely
kind of mind-boggling how
it
widespread that
is.
is.
Yeah, it is. And that's precisely what motivated the then Surgeon General Vivek Murthy in 2023 to issue what was the first health advisory issued by a Surgeon General of the United States, a health advisory on the health impact of loneliness. Never before has loneliness been called out as a public health issue. This was really the very first time.
So one of the shocking things about the study that I mentioned earlier that will be the centerpiece of what we're talking about today is the tie to physical health. Because of course we all know when we're struggling in our relationships, if you're not getting along with somebody who's important to you in your life, or you're just feel lonely and isolated, we all know just that feels horrible. But one of the take-home messages of this is that actually it's a physical health issue as well. And in fact, not only it's a physical health issue, but it's as important to physical health as all of these other things that we hear about all the time. what's surprising to me about that is that you just don't hear about this. Like if you go to your doctor, how often do they, they'll ask you, if you smoke, they'll check on your diet, your level of exercise. Are you overweight? And like these things, of course, are just commonplace. How often do they say, hey, how are your relationships? Here's some things you could do to bolster feelings of connection. Like how often does that happen? It doesn't happen. So there's some kind of disconnect. So maybe we could dive into the physical health piece of this, because I think it's just not intuitive for some reason, even though the data is pretty clear. So what did this
Yeah.
study actually show?
Well, but before I get to this study, let me just say one other thing about that disconnect, and that is that this disconnect is really a historical consequence of a divide between the mind and the body that has been around in Western thinking from the time of the Greek.
Yeah, I was going to say
Uh,
this goes way back to the roots of like the Western philosophical traditions.
exactly, exactly, and uh, it's a very pervasive dichotomy that has um, resulted in modern Western medicine being so fractionated and um, where there are specialists in different organ systems without thinking about how those are all connected to one another and to the mind and the brain. And so the data on loneliness is really part of a larger picture that is beginning to help us appreciate how these factors like loneliness actually are related to what we think of. We often talk about systemic biology, biology in the body, or peripheral biology, biology below the neck, and how our moods, our emotions, our demeanor, through its uh, um, activation of different networks in the brain, has communication with the body that influences our physical health. And it's important to recognize that this is a bidirectional pathway. So it's also the case that the body influences the mind and the brain in a way that is at least equal to, in some cases, even more than the way the mind influences the body.
Yeah, well, we need to bookmark this for a
Yeah,
further discussion, because my mind is
exactly.
suddenly spinning. I mean, this, it totally reminds me of the really maybe the main guiding principle from the entirety of Buddhist psychology, which is the principle that, of course, you know well, which is interdependence. And it's just the simple idea. I mean, it's kind of systems thinking for the spiritual path. It's just that no phenomenon, you could think of a thought, an emotion, an instance of suffering, really anything in the world and certainly in one's inner experience. And the whole idea is that nothing exists on its own. It's all part of this really complex web of causes and conditions. And therefore, to really work with your own mind and inner experience in a healthy way, you need to have that systems perspective. And you need to start to understand all of the different influences that are taking place in any given point in time. And it's just exceedingly complex. But in any case, so we can
Yeah,
just put a pin in that, because that,
yeah,
I don't think we
mm,
plan to talk about that, but that would be a fascinating
yes, I
discussion. But let's
agree.
go back to the study. So going back to the findings from this meta-analysis, what is this whole 15 cigarettes thing? Is that even how true to the actual data is that?
Yeah. So this is a meta-analysis that was published in 2015 by Holt Lundstad, a hyphenated name, and
And we can
colleagues.
we'll put a link
Yeah.
in the bio for anybody
And
who wants to read.
it was it was a study that aggregated findings from 46 different studies that involved almost 2,000 total participants. It's about 1,970 something. Um, and uh, they looked across these studies to look at the relationship between um, different measures of loneliness and social isolation and their relationship to specifically to mortality and to premature mortality. And they were able to look at a number of other risk factors that you mentioned earlier, Court, that have been commonly associated with health risks like smoking, and exercise, things like that, to take them into account to look at the unique effects of loneliness and social isolation after controlling for these other factors like smoking, for example. Um, and the big bottom line in this study is that loneliness and social isolation, and one of the things that the study found is that uh, there are many different ways to look at this, and these findings were quite robust across all the different ways in which you can look at this. Um, and what they showed is that loneliness and social isolation indeed is a very significant risk factor for premature mortality. And the data actually show that loneliness and social isolation is a more significant risk factor for premature mortality than is smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day, which is kind of astounding. Um,
And that
uh,
itself was at the top of the list relative to, obesity, diet, exercise, all these other things that we commonly think of as like the main things we do for our physical health. So
yeah, and actually talking about obesity, which yeah, is a very common risk factor, loneliness is more than double the risk factor than obesity for
that's shocking.
premature mortality.
That's shocking.
Yeah.
And if you just think about the healthcare system and how designed it is around specific risk factors like obesity is an obvious one. I mean, these days with all the GLP-1 inhibitors and I mean this is like big business, right? So nobody's found the business model for kindness and compassion. And I mean, anyways, I don't get too jaded and skeptical, but why has this not become as prevalent as it should be in terms of the discussion we have around physical health, given the data? I mean, this is with hundreds of thousands of people. This is like large scale epidemiological data. This isn't like small studies.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that's all very, very true. And I think one of the silver linings um, in this kind of uh, study and the findings that we're talking about is that loneliness and social isolation actually is something that can be addressed by um, by ourselves. We are actually in control of our own minds, and um, we can make a difference in terms of our experience of uh, loneliness, and that may have, in turn, all kinds of beneficial downstream effects that influence the kind of outcomes that we see in the research on loneliness.
I'd love to talk about the practice side of this, as you're alluding to now. Maybe as part of that, I'd be curious, do we know do we know the mechanisms through which feelings of loneliness and other forms of social disconnection, like how does it impact our physical health, or why does it impact our physical health to such a degree? I mean, we can, you know, if you think about poor diet or lack of exercise, you can see this very direct. It's not too hard to understand. But why would feeling lonely have such a huge effect on our physical health, even our risk of dying at any at a given stage of life?
Yeah, I think the most honest answer to that is we don't fully know. There are, I think, mechanisms that we can point to that are likely candidates for at least contributing to this. So, for example, one of them has to do with stress reactivity, and particularly with something that in a whole long body of work that we've done at the Center for Healthy Minds, looking at resilience and its opposite. One of the ways we think about resilience is that it is impacted by how quickly we recover from adversity. People who recover quickly are more resilient. People who recover more slowly are less resilient. And when we are lonely, um, for a variety of different reasons, we recover more slowly. And that's something that when it accumulates over time can really be toxic to our physical health.
Hmm. Hmm. And so let's go maybe back to the point you made a few moments ago, which is that these are largely experiences, you could say, that are within our control. Like we can influence how connected or disconnected we feel at any given point in time very directly, in the same way, you know, you can work with your attention and other things that we talk about regularly. That's not so much the case with some biological mechanisms where you can influence them, but it might be much more difficult. It much take a lot longer time. When it comes to connection, if we have this idea that connection is a skill, which is something you say often, and it very much is echoed in the contemplative and meditative traditions of the world, what what would you say about that again from a scientific point of view? Like what do we know? Is there evidence showing that you can directly intervene on like that feeling of connection?
Yes, I would say there is evidence that we can directly intervene, and there's a whole category of meditation practices that we've talked about together, and also in various research that we've done that are within the domain of connection practices. They include practices to cultivate kindness toward others, to cultivate compassion, practices that involve appreciation and gratitude, all of those kinds of practices that could be, really simple and quite short. Uh, and also, they don't have to be formal meditation practices. They can be things that we sprinkle through our everyday life. Those simple little practices can really help us feel more connected to those around us, even people that we don't know. Um, they're very accessible.
Yeah, as you know, I'm a complete and utter nerd when it comes to meditative systems, and I've studied over the years and been very fascinated by different models of training these skills. So taking this idea that something like kindness or compassion as a skill, it's something that you learn, it's something you practice and train in. And you find in many different traditions, I think in the Buddhist tradition, which we're probably most familiar with, there's this very systematic process where it's almost as though you kind of, maybe an easiest way to think about it is you actually start where it's easiest to feel a sense of connection. And the first thing you learn is how do you kind of trigger that feeling of connection? That's kind of the first thing. And so you start with the easiest thing. If you were to hang out with a bunch of Tibetans, they'd be talking about their moms all the time. And that like Tibetan culture is a culture where it's almost like moms are like gods and goddesses. I mean, they're like they're like deified. So for Tibetans, that's the easiest thing. Like you think of your mother and you think about the love you've received. Of course, Tibetans, when they came to the West, they very quickly learned that we have slightly more complex feelings about our parents. So they kind of adjusted. But the key thing is just like whatever's easiest. You know, you could think of your pet, you could think of a child, you could think of a dear friend, you could really whatever helps you feel that sense of connection. But you just start where it's easy. You just start where you can bring something to mind, a memory, a thought, whatever, that just puts you in that space of feeling connection. And then the practice is to extend that. And you start again, you don't like go immediately to your most complicated, difficult relationship. You do this very methodical expansion where you learn to sort of elicit and savor that feeling of connection, and then you extend it a little bit. It's almost like you're pushing the boundaries of your care and compassion further and further and further until eventually, if you do this for a lifetime, like nothing is left out. Like you eventually go beyond your own circle of people you already know. You might go to, what you might think of as like neutral people. Of course, they're not inherently neutral. They're just neutral to you because you don't know them. But you start doing that to the barista at your local coffee shop or a clerk at the grocery store. And then eventually even to people that are difficult to you. And then in the Buddhist tradition, you'd have this whole thing of all beings, all forms of life, not only all people. But it's very methodical. I mean, this is like years, even decades of practice. And it's all just to do what you're talking about. It's taking an idea of something like kindness and treating it as a skill, something that's malleable. So anyways, we've obviously started to study this just in a very preliminary way. But there's centuries, millennia of accumulated knowledge and wisdom in how to do this in these meditative traditions, which is also quite
Yeah,
in short supply today.
and the science shows that if you take people who've never meditated before and you teach them exactly the kind of skill training that you're describing, Court, where you start with a person or a pet that is easy and close to you, and then gradually expand. But do this just for 2 weeks for not more than 30 minutes a day. So it's a maximum of 7 hours across 2 weeks. Your brain can actually change.
Hmm.
We've shown that. There's other research that has shown that. It really doesn't take that much to get these networks in the mind and the brain going. And we often say that it doesn't take that much to get them going because our inherent nature is actually to be kind to others. There's research that indicates that even very young infants show this proclivity to be kind toward others, but it requires nurturing for it to be strengthened and for it to become robust and extended. And so that's exactly what this training is building upon.
Yeah, I mean that fits perfectly with the meditative view, which is it's actually very uh, easy in a sense to have that shift from feeling connected or feeling disconnected to feeling connected. The challenge is actually the challenges are twofold. One is a challenging simply to remember to do it. I think out of habit, we just get caught up in our habitual conditioned modes of being in the world and we just forget it. We're just kind of running a script in our mind all the time. And usually it's not the compassion and kindness script, unfortunately, for humanity. So part of it is just remembering to do it. The other challenge is it's a lot easier to make that switch than it is to sustain it. So a lot of the practice is, it's actually, this term isn't used, but it's almost learning to savor, to stay in that place of connection, to kind of just kind of rest in it, to immerse oneself in it. And that's a little more challenging. So even as we're talking, because we're talking all about connection, I've had all these little moments throughout this, these few minutes. We've been talking for 20 minutes. The first thing, interestingly, was I saw over your left shoulder. Actually, people who've been watching this have probably been wondering what on earth is that over your left shoulder. I'm imagining. So these are something from the Tibetan tradition that are called katas. They're basically white silk scarves, or usually they're white, but silk scarves. There's this thing in Tibetan culture. It's really beautiful, where when you meet someone, when somebody's coming back from a trip, or you're meeting an important person, like if you go to meet the Dalai Lama or somebody like that, in the tradition, you would offer them a silk scarf, and then they would offer it back to you. And so it's like that first connection is an act of generosity where each of you has essentially given something to one another. And I'm guessing, tell me if I'm wrong here, that those are katas that you have received from the Dalai Lama. Am I right about that?
Yes, that's a small sample of them. Yes.
I imagine you probably have like 20
A
pounds
closet
of
full.
katas he's given you over the years. But it's interesting, just as a little example of what you're talking about, Richie, about these can be just little moments that you're scattering throughout your day. Is just as you were talking, I just saw that, as I do every time we talk and you're in your office. And I just knowing that that's likely something that was given to you by His Holiness, immediately that just sparked this memory of having actually seen you two together, where you're kind of touching heads. That's like another very traditional Tibetan greeting. And just the love and affection that you and His Holiness have for each other. Every time I've seen you interact, there's just this deep, just love. I don't even know what else to call it. And you can just see it when you two see and interact with each other. So I just saw that silk kata, and I just thought that. And it was just a moment. It wasn't even like I had to reflect on it, but just immediately it put me in this feeling of connection. Like, that's so beautiful. It's been so beautiful to witness your relationship with him. So it's just an example of just that little shift in perspective of just noticing something, noticing anything really that elicits that feeling of warmth, of affection, of kindness, of care, of whatever flavor of connection. And then you just kind of do that throughout your day for these little moments. Like it's not like you have to sit down and close your eyes and meditate or something. It's just that little shift in perspective. And over time that becomes, as you've often said, it moves from being a fleeting state to a more enduring trait.
Yeah.
So I'm
So,
curious, what do you do? What are
yeah.
your little,
So, one of the things that you mentioned, which I think is so important, is that this is really a very simple prescription, and yet we often forget. We forget to do this when we get caught up in the activities of our daily life. And so, are there things that you all have in your daily life where you can use the activity itself as a reminder? So for me, one of the things that is always a helpful reminder is eating. I mean, we all eat. We have to eat, typically a few times a day, and that's an opportunity. And so if we just pair this simple practice with eating, and one of the things we can do when we eat is to just reflect on the people that it took to have food on our plate, and allow a sense of appreciation and gratitude for being able to have food that sustains us. And it also helps uh, um, to experience this sense of interconnection to them. And so this is a simple kind of connection practice that we could do every single day, every time we eat, and we can just do it in our own mind. Just takes a few seconds. And then another thing, I travel a lot in my work, and I actually just was in New York this week. And as I was changing planes in the Detroit airport, I was rushing to get from one gate to another. And then I remembered, wow, here I am in the airport. This is my laboratory for doing connection practice. And, initially I had forgotten. But, after a minute or two, I remembered here are all these people. They're also stressed getting between planes. And just looking at them and in my own mind, recognizing that they are the same as me and wishing to be happy, to be free of suffering, and just sending them a little smile, a kind of positive vibe. And, if there's an opportunity to help, you know, take someone's luggage and put it up in the luggage rack, you do that. Uh, those are the kind of everyday moments that when you do that regularly, they really do add up to making you feel more connected.
yeah, it's amazing. I mean, my mind is just filled with different examples of that now. And, having, as you and many of those who have listened previously know, I struggled with a lot of social anxiety early in life. And so I have these memories where I was surrounded by other people and felt totally alone. And there's really interesting science behind this, that oftentimes it is the perception of loneliness, disconnection, stress, many different things that's actually more predictive of, important mental health outcomes than the more objective side of it. In other words, how many people objectively are you surrounded by? Somebody could have looked at my experience if they had been doing a study and said, oh, he's surrounded by people. And actually, not only people, his friends. He's surrounded by people he knows and likes. He must be feeling a lot of connection. But I wasn't. Actually, I was feeling profoundly disconnected, in those, when I was in college and struggling with social anxiety. And I've also had experiences where I was completely alone. Like I've done long periods of solitary retreat, sometimes not talking for months on end, not seeing anybody for very long periods of time, and feel profoundly connected. So, of course, it's not that the external circumstances, the objective circumstances are totally irrelevant. They also are important, but it's how we feel about that is maybe the most important thing. And the biggest thing that you just shared, Richie, that again, I think is at the heart of this, thinking about this as a skill, and your airport story is a perfect illustration of this, is that oftentimes we move through life, whether we're alone or we're surrounded by other people, and we're just absorbed in our own inner world. We're lost in our thoughts. We're loosely connected to what's going on around us, but we're just sort of consumed in our inner world. And this shift is suddenly just opening up to all the connections that we have to the everything going on around us, or even beyond our immediate surroundings, like you said, with the people who prepare our food, for example. So oftentimes that itself is just the biggest shift. And it's not as though we're not connected and then we suddenly get connected. It's more that we're realizing and recognizing how incredibly intertwined our lives are with with so many other people and things and places and memories. All of this stuff is shaping our experience in every moment. But we just kind of lose sight of that. So it's not even that we're getting connected. We're just realizing that we are connected. And that's the big shift, is just shifting into that relational space. Then that's a huge playground. There's a lot you can do within that. But it all goes back to that it's our subjective experience that is maybe the most important thing here. So I don't know. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and just to put a little bit of science into that, it's uh this is an issue that you're alluding to that's a super important issue, and to frame it a little bit more sharply, it's we can say, is it the subjective experience of social isolation or social connection that is the key determinant, or is it the actual um, uh, uh, proximity to others that
Like
is
how many people you meet and interact with in a given day or something like that.
exactly? And the research is mixed in terms of this. There are some studies that clearly find that it's the subjective experience, as you were suggesting, Court, that is the key determinant. The study we were talking about earlier, by this big meta-analysis by Holt Lundstadt on loneliness and premature mortality, showed that these effects on the increased premature mortality among people who are lonely or socially disconnected occurred independent of which measure was used. So it seemed to be present across these different measures. And so we don't really fully understand it at this point. And a part of it may be simply a measurement issue. To some viewers who are not steeped in the science, sometimes I think people assume that when scientists are engaged in research, for example, on loneliness, we all have a shared understanding and agreement about what the right measure is. But it turns out that it's really more complicated, and that's still very much an evolving science in and of itself about how these constructs should best be measured. And so some of the disagreement in the scientific literature at this point in time may, at least in part, be accounted for by how we go about measuring these things.
So fascinating. Well, this has been a great discussion. I think one thing we can all agree on is that this is just an incredibly urgent public health need right now. The scale of the social disconnection that we have, both individually, but you can see between different groups, between different cultures, between countries, between political factions, between religions. I mean, you just make a long list of all of the disconnection that happens and all of the tragic suffering that's created as a result of that. This is maybe the most urgent thing to work on of our era, of our times. And the fact that there are these ancient practices where we can widen the circle, where we can loosen the rigidities of that disconnection. I think this is just not a luxury. This is a necessity for us as a species. We gotta figure this one out. So I don't know if any final thoughts. I have a feeling we're going to come back to this as a theme and a topic many times over. But any final thoughts?
I
Transition
think
out.
the only little thought that I would add, as we were alluding to earlier, is that I very much agree that it is a an extraordinarily urgent problem of our time, and changing it is easier than we think.
Hmm.
By doing these little things that we do, if we can sprinkle them through our daily life and do them every day, the research shows, and our experience as practitioners also confirms that it really can make a difference.
So important, Richie. Well, a wonderful discussion. Hopefully, all of you listening found something of value here, and hope to see you soon for another episode of Dharma Lab. Take care.
Thank you.